Welcome, everyone, to week 4 of our study of the Gospel of Matthew. I want to talk a little bit about keeping in mind some of the pressing questions, urgent issues of our time as we're studying the Gospel of Matthew, even this very week. Also want to say a brief word in this video about the first interpretive working paper, the instructions for which are in the work for the week, and you'll also be asked to choose your passage that you're going to do both your working and advanced interpretive papers on. And then finally, maybe a bit of segue into the next stretch of the narrative of the Gospel of Matthew, which is going to take us through these powerful scenes of chapters 8 and 9 and through the next significant discourse of Jesus' teaching, the second of the 5 discourses that punctuate the Gospel of Matthew. So first of all, just a word about current events. I think many of us have been watching some disturbing videos involving police violence against black people in the U.S., some counter violence as well, and the tendency of academic life for various reasons is perhaps to regard those matters as in a relatively separate realm and not to make them the subject of our learning, our conversation together, and I think that's a big mistake. So I worry a little bit about allowing the events that are sort of framed as national events, as national crises, for that sort of national horizon to overly determine our consideration of those events. Lots of, I think, problems with that, but nevertheless, I think that we've got to take seriously some of the deep injustices that are taking place in our time that owe a great deal to generations of a disease that we try to name with this term racism. So I want to just invite you quite directly now, just to the extent that you are comfortable or that you desire to incorporate any questions or reflections that you have in relation to the racist violence that has been filling our social media pages and whatnot this past week. Incorporate those into your responses to especially the study of the text of Matthew 8 to 10 in Forum 1 for this next week. And I might also include in the prompt for the second forum an invitation in the same vein. So let's not bracket these kinds of matters out of our study of the revelation of God and Jesus Christ according to Matthew. They need to be present. How they need to be present, I think, is a complex matter. I don't have all the answers for that. But I just want to invite you to regard the forums as welcome space for you to explore some of the implications of Matthew's gospel or the way that we approach it, for the troubling injustices that we're witnessing in our own time and places. Obviously, the last assignment for this course is a reflection paper on conflict according to Matthew, in which I will ask you to sort of describe the terms of the conflicts that we see in Matthew, and then to attempt to use those terms to shape your understanding of a pressing conflict of our own time. And there might be something about racist divisions that you'd like to reflect on in that final assignment. But even now, I just want to make sure we don't pretend that that's happening in some universe separate from this class, because it's not. And just to be maybe a little more transparent about Fuller, Fuller is not innocent in the landscape that we have inherited. It's not innocent in the kind of talk and rhetoric that is coming from many churches, evangelical churches in particular, that would keep us from taking this kind of racist injustice as seriously as we need to. Fuller has been a part of an evangelical subculture that in many ways has contributed to some of the fear and tensions that are characterizing interactions between police and people of color, as well as others. And so I think it behooves us as those who are participating in Fuller's institution to make these matters of racial justice an explicit subject of our course to the extent that we're able, drawing upon the course material, and even perhaps pointing out how our course material might be inadequate in some ways in the face of these conflicts. So you're invited to incorporate your questions, reflections, etc., in a respectful way into the forums and discussion for this week. Secondly, you've got this interpretive working paper that is coming up. You're going to be submitting it to a partner in a few weeks here. And what I'm asking you to do this week is to simply choose the passage from the options that I give you and to read through the instructions for the assignment, and just to begin to think about what this assignment is going to look like for you. In broad terms, the goal of this assignment is to slow down your study of a particular passage to a crawl, to take the details of the passage as seriously as you can in an attempt to interpret it more soundly. It's a working paper insofar as it is a paper that does not necessarily contain a lot of conclusions. In fact, there needs to be a number of questions in your paper. The tone of your paper is investigative, exploratory. It's not simply brainstorming. As you'll see in the guide for the assignment, the stage of your study of the passage needs to be something past brainstorming, but it's also a stage that has not reached necessarily really firm and settled conclusions about what the passage is saying. So I'm trying to open up some intermediate space or a phase in your study of a particular passage that allows you to probe it with the skills and sensibilities that hopefully you're beginning to acquire through the course. So a great deal of the paper, of course, is about situating your passage in the flow of the narrative, but it is at the same time paying close attention to the subtleties, the particular colors, texture of the passage that you're studying. It's kind of nitty-gritty, small twists and turns that the pace of our reading can sometimes keep us from paying adequate attention to, or because we're not reading them in the context of the narrative, we don't really know what to do with them. And so we make all kinds of crazy jumps from certain details of the passage instead of studying them with the grain of the story. So we'll have more room, obviously, to discuss the assignment in the coming weeks, but it is beginning to come into the weekly work this week by your choosing your passage and reading the guide for the assignment to begin to get a sense of what you'll be doing in it. And finally, just a couple words about where we're at in this story, where we're going this week. I really appreciate some of the comments and discussion about how to understand law. In fact, some of you have rightly questioned whether or not that's even a good way to understand what the Torah and the prophets are about. That translation, that term, has maybe led us to underestimate or not appreciate what's actually in the first 5 books of Scripture or what the prophets are about. Obviously, these are not books full of just rules. They are books full of story, full of promise, full of poetry. I mean, that's all just in the first 5 books that we call law. So to think of the law in terms of just commands that have to be obeyed is not really an adequate picture of what the words of the Torah include or what they're about. And along these lines, I'd encourage you to resist the tendency that many of us have in our sort of stream of the Christian tradition, which is to imagine the Torah as basically a kind of frozen picture of what God intends. A frozen picture of what God intends. So that everything that happens from the giving of the Torah forward is simply repeated failures of Israel and the world to embody what was always God's original design. The Torah isn't a frozen picture like that. The Torah itself is self-revising, you might say. Think of the relationship between Exodus and Deuteronomy, the way that Deuteronomy loops legislatively back to some of the same issues, same difficulties that were addressed in Exodus. We could say the same thing about how different sort of stages in Israel's story talk to one another critically. I mean, we could talk just about Joshua and Judges, for example. But even within the 5 books of the Torah, there are all kinds of very interesting tensions between the way the life of Israel is kind of laid out in Genesis and then the way later stages in Israel's story engage that past. So I think it's better to imagine Torah as a pregnant, living organism. Something that is full of all kinds of possibilities, as opposed to something that already contains God's original intent. And it's in that sense that I think we have Jesus teaching us in the Sermon on the Mount about the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Fulfillment not just as Jesus has come to finally get it right after so many people have gotten it wrong. Instead, Jesus has come to lead his people in embodying the future to which the law and the prophets have led them. And a future that is now possible because the kingdom of heaven that they anticipated has finally begun to come. So that is a different notion of fulfillment that I hope is a little richer than just thinking of Jesus has come finally to get it right, and it's our job to finally get it right. There's a little more to it than that because the law itself grows with time. As we move into the next stage of the narrative, you'll see that the closing words of the Sermon on the Mount from the narrator, that the people, the crowds, were astonished at the power or the authority with which Jesus was teaching. It's unlike the power of the scribes, the authorities that they are accustomed to being guided by. And that is, I think, a key link to what comes next in the story, because we're going to get a succession of scenes intricately woven together that in their sequence convey to us the power, the authority of Jesus. And so we're going to want to pay careful attention to that theme as a way of holding together our emerging interpretations of these scenes of the story. I hope that as characters begin to come into the story with more color, that you will do your best to be patient with the details that are given us about those characters, and to study them and to work with them to fill out the thickest description you can of who these people are that Jesus interacts with. That, I think, will enrich your interpretation of these scenes immensely, and frankly, it will help all of us avoid some of the kind of platitudinous or cliche ways of interpreting the significance of these stories. For example, we're going to have Jesus interact in a noticeable sequence with a leper, and then with a centurion in his own town, and then with Peter's mother-in-law. And it's very easy to see the centurion, who's part of the occupying force there in Capernaum, the commander, as simply a representative of all Gentiles or something like that. And I don't think that that kind of jump is very sound. Of course, there are implications in the story about what Jesus and the kingdom of heaven means for Gentiles, but the centurion is not just a Gentile. The centurion is an authority, a power, a Roman power. The centurion is the figure that lives in Capernaum as that kind of power. The centurion is one who has power over another, his own servant, for whom he is advocating in his approach to Jesus. All of these kinds of details, the particular words that he says to Jesus, are of immense importance for interpreting the significance, the meaning of that story. And of course, coming right on the tail of Jesus encountering a leper. So just right off the bat, can you see that in the face of Jesus, a leper and a Roman centurion find themselves on the same footing of need for Jesus' power? That's something powerful already about who Jesus is. Bless you as you study this week. Enjoying the class a bunch myself. Hope you are too.